Hello, Blake. I'm very happy we start our new series of conversations with fellows and NEC with you. You've been spending here 5 months as a NEC International Fellow. Could you tell more about your project here at NEC, your academic background, and sort of results, let's say, of your project here at NEC?
Okay, so my time at NEC was spent writing up a first draft of my dissertation thesis, which I'm doing in history for Northwestern University in the US and the École des études en sciences sociales in Paris. And I had applied to NEC last year, having finished some of my archival work, but still in the process of doing that in France, and still kind of thinking through how to conceptualize that material. So I had written this 4 or 5 page proposal that ended up looking rather different from what I've done here in the thesis and from the presentation that I gave last month, which I feel like is a good thing, and in part it's been through the course of conversations and seminars and with people I've met here that I've been able to think more clearly about what it is I want to do in the thesis. What I'm looking at in this project is French understandings of India, of the Indian subcontinent as an economic and political space in the 18th century, and trying to get at what I see as a central paradox where French traders are going to India to purchase sophisticated Indian goods, to make money in vibrant Indian markets, but the intellectual discourse in France about India is not only very negative, but really insists that India is a space of stagnation, where there's no economic vibrancy, where everyone sits around in a hut eating grains of rice. And this becomes kind of a template for an Orientalist imaginary in the 19th and 20th century. And some of the framework that I had thought I would use in the proposal has now been reworked or jettisoned, but it's been very stimulating to be here and to have to talk about my work to people who are coming from different disciplines, from different fields entirely, and to see their perspectives.
Going back to your project, I understood that your dissertation and also this project work at the border between intellectual history, looking at the 18th century French thought on political economy, but also you look at institutions and subjects at this interface or this exchange between France and India. So how you define in terms of field? Project?
I haven't quite figured out the phrase that I want to use for this, but I would like to say that I do kind of an intellectual history or a history of economic thought, but about people who aren't intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
So I look mostly at French traders in India, or French merchants, French manufacturers who are involved with selling goods to India or trying to compete with goods coming from India, and the way they talk about this place in their correspondence, in documents that they produce to try to influence state policy. And to be sure, I also look at a handful of major intellectuals like Montesquieu, but I'm more interested in the kind of thought that's going on in these people who are involved with India in some way, and who have to make sense of their experiences.
These people you are working with, you have major intellectuals like Montesquieu, Reynal, and other people involved in all these debates, and you also have traders or even missionaries talking about India. How did you go with your research, going back to undercover all this public debate? Because intellectual published, but afterwards, how you find the voices of these merchants or missionaries?
My time in the archive began 6 years ago, when I spent a year in Aix-en-Provence, which is where the French colonial archives are. And this was not the most efficient way to do things, but I spent several months just reading everything that had come out of French India from about 1750 to 1800. Luckily, they were, small colonies, so with enough time one can read all the private correspondence that was gathered up, all of the official papers, and through the course of reading that, I began to have a sense of what the major themes of people's perceptions are. And then I could do more targeted kind of interventions in other archives. So there are archives of the French Foreign Mission Society that had been in India, archives of diplomatic personnel. I went to India for about 5 weeks in the hope of finding some things that had not been recuperated by the French during decolonization that they had taken with them. But there wasn't much left there. Some of it is working through institutional structures. So there was a French East India Company that has papers preserved, and I could work through their correspondence. But a lot of it is looking through people's private papers that happen to have been caught up by some other government archive. And so, I'm sure there are many other interesting and similar things that had not been recovered or have been recovered in some other archive where one would not expect them. But at least through what I was able to find over the past few years, I think I've been able to create a representative portrait of what these people were thinking.
I remember that your presentation here for next seminars was about Orientalism and the Great Divergence in relation to this Franco-Indian trade. You very well contextualized your project into these big debates about Orientalism in the aftermath of Edward Said's work, but also the debate and discussions about Great Divergence between the economic development of Western Europe and Asia, and especially Kenneth Pomerantz's book about the Great Divergence was a book very much discussing in the historiography. What were because I remember in the seminar you tried to challenge some of the main ideas in these debates. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So in the past, I think 20 years in global economic history, there's been a new sense of the way in which the European economy or the Western European economy really resembled that of South Asia, East Asia, until quite recently, so until maybe 1750 or 1800, depending on who you follow, and that the reason for Europe's industrial takeoff and its entrance into this cycle of economic growth, it can't be a story about something culturally or civilizationally different about Europe. It has to be something in a set of factors that changes in a very limited period. And I think that's all very salutary and appropriate, and I'm very much working within that tradition. But a kind of problem that's arisen in the course of this new economic perspective is how to correlate that with what we've already known about the rise of Orientalism in the same period or even earlier. So how is it that there's this emerging, stereotypical, a very pejorative understanding of Asia that's taking place in Europe at the same time or maybe earlier in this economic divergence? And there's been some work to suggest, offered by people in this economic field, to say, well, maybe Orientalism is a consequence of this industrialization. People in Europe have a sense that they're doing something different and unprecedented, and so they're developing this more negative perception of Asia. And that may be a part of the story, because things are always complicated and multi-layered, but I think it's definitely not the main thing, and it's certainly obscuring the way in which negative perceptions of Asia are very often offered by Europeans who are in a position of having to compete with sophisticated Asian commodities or who are struggling to get access to Asian markets. And often it kind of serves as a way of compensating for unsatisfying realities. And so what I'm trying to offer is a more nuanced understanding of Orientalism. So it's not just a discourse of European power or reflection of European power, but also a way of disguising European weakness or of achieving something psychologically, and of showing how the links between intellectual history and economic history can be quite surprising. It's not just that one determines another or some level is more primary, but there's a dialectic going on between them.
It was very interesting during your presentation because you also uncovered the anxieties French intellectual had about this economic relationship and trade relationship with India. And Orientalist discourse at the time was not only about the European superiority, but also was a kind of concern with self-identity and the way France, in terms of politics, economy, was going through at that time. So that was very interesting. And you had intellectuals like Sieyès that shaped the debates about political order in France. And you ended up your seminar with a very interesting and, in a way, paradoxical formula saying that, in a way, French Revolution was a process to make French less Indian than they were. Could you explain more?
Sure. And here I haven't yet decided how to frame it in my thesis, but I've been thinking there's about the anthropologist Louis Dumont, right?
Yeah.
Who, after his time studying caste societies, comes back to France and writes this book, Homo Hierarchicus, Hierarchical Man, to talk about how people are in caste society, and Homo Equalis, to talk about the modern European conception of the individual. And for him, the 18th century is this moment where we see a kind of political or sociological divergence between Europe and Asia, and European man is moving out of this hierarchical system into a new conception of individualism. And I think to the extent that that might be true, it's true not because it reflects some pre-existent or deep structural difference between these societies, but because people, even in France, are using Orientalist stereotypes, are looking at India in this period, and are explicitly comparing old regime France to Indian caste society. So at the end of the presentation, I cite Sieyès, who does this in What is the Third Estate, which is kind of the most powerful and influential camp of the French Revolution. But there are a number of other figures in this 18th century period who are trying to talk about the ways that aristocracy in France is like the caste system in India and is therefore inappropriate for what's supposed to be a progressive and enlightened Europe. And I think it's really fascinating to see that what's often talked about in 20th century anthropological or sociological literature as some long-standing difference between two radically different sorts of civilizations. Here in the 18th century, in this polemical literature, there's a sense of a total continuity between India and France. And the goal is to have a revolution in France in order to eliminate that spectrum, in order to create a radically different kind of society that wouldn't be Indian. I'm still working through the way that I would like to insert that story into a longer intellectual trajectory. So I didn't mention Dumont, for instance, in the presentation, but I'm looking forward to figuring out what to do with it.
Referring to Dumont and taking over that and reformulating his ideas and even criticizing him is a very good way to bring this into larger debates at the border between anthropology and history, and I think it's a good move. But you were also, and during the fellow seminar last November, during the board meeting here, you also had an intervention that I found very interesting about answering to the question, do scholars have a say in the public intellectual debate? Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. So I described an anecdote that had happened to me about a year prior, and certainly when I think about the other kind of people in the next seminar, many of whom are doing social science work with direct policy implications. I don't think of myself as someone who has something political to say or who has a message for the public sphere. But on the basis of an experience I had, I'm now very cautious about denying any political role, because I think whether or not I would like to have one, my work will be available and will be taken up in all kinds of ways. So a year ago I had written an essay on an 18th century Indian ruler who was the main ally and trading partner of the French in this period, who now is very debated within Indian historiography because he was a Muslim sultan of the South Indian state. He has been described as persecuting Hindus and Christians under his rule, but also because he was allied with the French against the British, is presented as a nationalist hero. And so, for instance, just this year, on his birthday, a local government had a ceremony to honor him. Hindu nationalists attacked the ceremony, a number of people died. It remains contentious even as we speak. And I had written an essay, not about this at all, but criticizing the way that he was treated in the description of an artifact at the Victorian Albert Museum. And I said, they relied on some of these tropes about him being oppressive and a fanatical Muslim tyrant, and I tried to contextualize that and to show, in fact, he had cordial relationships with the French and, was part of a whole global conversation. So I thought I was doing my job as a good Western intellectual talking to other liberal intellectuals, and I saw that this article over the following days was taken up by some people on Twitter who were, in my mind, quite right-wing Muslim activists in India who were saying, see, indeed, Tipu Sultan, this ruler, was a nationalist hero, and trying to rub that in the face of some right-wing Hindu nationalist. And this is not a debate I would like to be involved in. For me, it's a pity both sides can't lose. But it's a reminder that what one does is always accessible and can be taken up in different ways, and that I need to keep in mind the multiplicity of audiences for this work, that it's not just a safe academic conversation, that it's something that always has the potential to go out into the real world.
In a way, I find it really telling that your case, the situation where an essay about a historical character in 18th century had a kind of contemporary relevance and is taken up in the public debate. It reminds me of all these debates in 18th century France about these issues about textiles, Indian textile trade, and how this becomes important ideas in the public sphere.
Yeah. Things that seem so anodyne can become intensely polemical very quickly.
Why were the French so fascinated with Indian textiles?
Well, so on a material level, which is already a bit outside my own expertise, Indian textiles in the early modern period were the best in the world. They were the most finely woven, they were dyed with the brightest and most long-lasting colors, and European manufacturers for about 200 years really couldn't figure out how to replicate these material qualities. They were also cheaper than their European equivalents, and they flooded into markets in Britain, the Netherlands, and France. And there's been quite, for me, convincing arguments made by different groups of historians to suggest that the consumption of these textiles by not just aristocrats, but by a growing segment of the urban middle classes set off the consumer revolution, so that people came to expect that every year there would be different kinds of textiles, and this is the beginning of a fashion cycle. And it also helped to set off the Industrial Revolution, as European manufacturers realized that the only way they would be able to compete with these textiles would be to invent new chemical dyes, to invent new mechanical processes of weaving, to compete with the advantages that India had in this sector. And what I'm trying to do is to supplement that now rather well-known story within the economic literature with an examination of the way that French people are talking about these textiles. Because over the course of the 18th century, even as Indian textiles continue to be superior to French ones, there's an emerging discourse among intellectuals and among economic agents of various kinds to say, well, these Indian textiles are superior at the present moment, but because we are intellectually, spiritually, psychologically superior to Indians, at some point in a generation or two, we'll have caught up with them and we'll go beyond them. So there's this development, I'm arguing, a European identity secured by Orientalist tropes about South Asian inferiority that works to kind of undo a troubling real situation by imagining these superior qualities that Europeans are supposed to have. But it's not just, on the level of discourse. That imagination then encourages these industrialists to go out and invest more in new chemical and mechanical processes. So there's a feedback between the practice and the discourse that they're developing.
Talking about a very important concept in the 18th century French economic thought is emulation, emulation. Could you tell me more about that? Because it's a concept that is, as you said, in this discussion of liberal thinkers and laissez-faire political economy, you have also this concept that was very important in the 18th century that somehow disappears, like from the discussions later on.
So one of the things that I'm arguing in the dissertation is that the emergence of liberal or laissez-faire ideas in this period isn't so much a story about people believing in universal economic laws or in homo economicus, but it's really about groups of people becoming convinced that within European societies, certain kinds of people can engage in unregulated competition, but that it will be socially beneficial. So I think before this period, economic activity was often understood as ambition or greed or avarice, and competition seems rather frightening and destructive as a force. One of the things that people do in this period is use the concept of emulation, which already existed in the artistic world, to describe a kind of benevolent, mutual admiration that artists feel for each other, which leads them each to want to produce better things in order to outdo their rival. Taking this concept, which is quite benign, and applying it to economic competition. Two manufacturers, each trying to produce cheaper goods, are understood in the work of certain laissez-faire economists as being the same as two painters of rival schools, which is a much easier sell to the public for laissez-faire policies. The connection with India in this context is that French authors thinking about this effort to imitate Indian textiles talked very explicitly about the need to emulate India. So Indians have these skills and techniques and knowledge that the French don't have for textile production, and the French want to imitate them and then outdo them. So this process of emulation. And the kind of logical thing one might worry about is, well, if we, the French, are trying to do that, then won't the Indians, just emulate us, and since they're already ahead of us, well, how will we ever catch up? And they develop quite sophisticated, we could say, theories as to why emulation is possible in France and not in India. So they say emulation needs a robust public sphere, private property, a certain kind of constitutional government, which they argue are all missing in India. And I didn't talk about this in my presentation because it feels like perhaps maybe a more niche topic, but it's certainly at the core of my thesis, and I'm working now on developing it in a couple of side projects to look at the way, for instance, in the same period, Jews are talked about as being overly emulative. So you can be not quite emulative enough, but you can also be too competitive, too economically oriented within this kind of imagination. And the larger point that I'm trying to draw out of this is that the sanitized history of economic thought that we often get, where liberal ideas are about universalism or about a certain notion of the individual, that this really isn't fair to the whole story, in which laissez-faire is understood and sold to people in a context of ethnic stereotypes, of certain ideas about political economy and how a political regime should look, and a whole notion of other non-economic ideas that are part of this mix.
Already in this conversation, it's obvious that you are familiar and very easy to discuss interdisciplinary issues, opening to disciplines like anthropology or economics or even theory of art or aesthetics. How is it to be in an institute like New York College, where you have different projects from various disciplines? What were your experience in that sense?
But for me, it's been really a delight to have people from not only all kinds of fields of history, with which I'm not necessarily familiar, but the social sciences, disciplines whose practitioners I never get a chance to talk to in my work at Northwestern or HSS. And of course, on the one hand, it's been a challenge. So to give a presentation pitch to people who are very bright, but who don't necessarily know anything about the content of what I'm doing, that's a real challenge, to make something that will be clear and interesting, and will also be able to survive their very sharp questions about my methodology, questions that, as a historian kind of living in my methodology like a fish lives in water, you don't question or think about, and then you're exposed to someone who has radically different presuppositions. But I think that's been very healthy and has really helped prepare me to go on the market in the fall, as I intend to. And it's, I think, very good to be able to say that I've had such an experience and to be able to show that I've done something profoundly interdisciplinary. I'm applying even now for a couple of external fellowships, and I'll have an interview next month for one. And one of the big criteria that they're looking for is someone who's capable of interdisciplinary conversation. So I think practically within the academic institutions, it's nice to be able to tell a story about one's interdisciplinary experience, and also in terms of my own research and intellectual trajectory, it's been very enriching. I can't say that the questions and comments I pose to other people have necessarily always been as useful and fruitful as the ones that they pose to me in my presentation, but I hope that there's been a reciprocal benefit.
How was your experience also being in Bucharest? Is it the first time?
In fact, I was here last year thanks to a conference that was organized by now an alumna of NEC Fellow last year. And I came on a couple of rather gray November days, so it didn't have the most beautiful impression of the city, which now, when the approach of spring is waking up. But I found the conference extremely stimulating, and I thought this is a really fascinating intellectual environment. This is a great place to be. And then over the 5 months, it's been really a joy to discover a city and a country that I really knew nothing about beforehand. I've been given a very comfortable apartment by NEC in a very nice neighborhood, and it's come to feel very familiar to me. And now I'm already quite sad and nostalgic to think about it.
Blake, it was a pleasure talking with you, and you are always welcome.
You're excellent.
And good luck with your future projects, and I hope your dissertation will be successfully soon defended.
Thank you very much.